Have you ever wondered where the term Casanova, used for womanizers, comes from? Most people think his is just a simple love story set in bedrooms, but they are wrong. Today, I'm going to tell you about a man who was a doctor of law, a fugitive who escaped from history's most impossible prison, a mathematician who managed the treasuries of kings, a tragic hero who was dealt such a blow by fate that he ended up in bed with his own daughter, and of course, a philandering lover expert at charming women. Here he is with all his masks. Giacomo Casanova. The Venice of the 1750s was a worn-out, weary, yet equally arrogant jewel of Europe. While the salty waters of the Adriatic licked the feet of marble palaces like a serpent, the city lived a double life, a devout Catholic by day and a sinner hidden behind masks by night. In Venice, masks were not just an accessory. They were a status, an escape, and most importantly, an absolute shield of secrecy. Who was a duke and who was a thief would only become clear at dawn, when those balls smelling of cheap wine, heavy powder, and dampness ended. In the dim light of the street lamps, the heavy layer of mist settling over the canals was enough to cover every kind of secret. The sound of oars from gondolas gliding through the canals were silent witnesses to secret meetings and political assassinations. The city, though grand in appearance from the outside, was internally in the grip of a corrupt aristocracy. In this misty and uncanny city, Giacomo Casanova shone like a sun. During that period, Casanova was gambling not just with women, but with all the nerve endings of society. What made him dangerous was not just his good looks, but his unstoppable intellectual arrogance and his never-ending hunger for the forbidden. Despite having received training as a cleric, Casanova mocked the dogmas the church called untouchable at every opportunity. With the speeches he made in the squares, he exposed the ignorance of the nobles and the corruption of the church. In secret raids on his home, Kabbalistic manuscripts, forbidden philosophy books, and manuscripts containing dark alchemy rituals, all considered diabolical by the Inquisition of the time, were found. Casanova was not just in pursuit of physical pleasure. He was holding a torch to the darkest corners of the soul and knowledge. While pushing the limits of reason and pleasure, he was actually preparing his own imprisonment warrant with his own hands, staining it with ink. Venice's famous and feared Council of Ten watched his every step, adding his every laugh to his thick file as a crime against the state. In every corner of the city, there were informant boxes known as the Lion's Mouth. People would drop anonymous letters into these boxes to accuse one another of irreligion or espionage. Casanova's rivals almost raced with one another to fill these boxes against him. One evening, at one of the city's most magnificent masquerade balls, he set his eyes on a woman whose elegance took the breath away of the entire hall. The woman was an aristocrat belonging to one of Venice's most powerful and established families. Casanova did not use just physical attraction to impress her. He was a master of mental manipulation. He deployed his captivating oratory, which blended his knowledge of medicine, law, and philosophy. Every word he whispered into the woman's ear pierced her heart like a poisoned arrow. He spoke to her of undiscovered corners of the world, forbidden sciences, and the depths of the soul. The woman could not resist this man, a mixture of intelligence and passion. The night ended in a secret room of the palace, amidst shadows that grew giant on the wall, and mingled with one another in the candlelight. For Casanova, this was a routine victory to be forgotten the next morning and added to his list of achievements. He did not ask the woman's name. He barely remembered her face in the darkness. When that night ended, he returned to the damp and moss-scented streets of Venice. He was proud of himself. He had conquered yet another fortress. He buried that night into the depths of his blurred mind, poisoned by alcohol, and dove into conquering different bodies. The Venetian Inquisition was now recording not just his philandering, but also his thought crimes against the state into his thick files. Casanova's connections with Masonic lodges and the French philosophy books he possessed further increased the suspicions against him. On a July morning in 1755, before the sun had even lit the towers of St. Mark's Square, the terrifying Inquisition guards known as the Reds arrived at his door. Still drowsy with sleep, Casanova was seized by the arms and dragged away. His crime was severe: sorcery, Freemasonry, possessing forbidden books, and disturbing the state order by violating the privacy of noble families. Casanova was thrown into the Piove, known as the Leads, Venice's highest and most secure prison. Located on the top floor of the Doge's palace, this cell took its name from the massive lid plates covering its roof. This was more a room for physical torture than a prison. When the Adriatic sun heated those leads in the summer, the cell turned into a 50-degree oven. In the winter, it became an icebox that froze one to the marrow. The cell was so low that Casanova, being tall, could not stand upright inside. Due to constantly standing hunched, permanent stooping and joint pains had developed in his back. There, Casanova was forgotten, destined to be buried in the dark waters of Venice. The narrowness of the cell and the low ceiling suffocated his free spirit, causing him to lose his mind more with each passing day. At night, he listened to the scratching of rats in the cell. By day, he heard the cheerful voices of people, songs, and the shouts of gondoliers coming from the lower floors of the palace. This contrast was the heaviest psychological pressure on him. The first months spent in prison were a total mental breakdown for Casanova. He had started talking to himself, engaging in arguments with imaginary figures on the cell walls. However, his desire for escape was more dominant than his hunger and thirst. While trying to dig up the floor in his first cell, he was caught by the guards and transferred to a much darker, damper cell. In this new cell, he fashioned a rusty iron bar he happened to find in the sewer drain with the precision of a genius. He began communicating with Father Balbi, a prisoner in the adjacent cell, through an incredible method: secret notes pricked with a needle hidden inside books. These notes were the only ray of hope traveling between the cold walls of the palace. Casanova sharpened that iron bar against a piece of marble for a full 8 months. Every night, listening to the heavy footsteps of the guards, he turned that metal into a sharp spike with great patience. That thin, annoying sound the metal made while rubbing against the marble was the symphony of freedom for him. Every stroke brought him a millimeter closer to freedom. Calluses had formed on his hands, his lungs were filled with dust, but he did not give up. At one point, he wrote to Father Balbi, "I will either fly out of here like an angel, or I will become a part of these walls. Surrender is not for me." On the night of October 31st, 1756, the plan was set in motion. Casanova and Father Balbi climbed onto the roof by piercing the ceiling of the leads. Outside was misty, rainy, and pitch black. When the lead plates under their feet combined with the rain, they turned into ice rinks. Beneath them was a precipice of hundreds of meters and the cold canals of Venice. Casanova was playing the biggest of all the gambling moves he had made in his life. His time, his own life, was on the table. They slid down the edge of the roof and reached a window. Casanova broke the window with a great noise using the heel of his shoe, and they dived inside. The place they entered was one of the dark personal rooms of the palace. The walls of the room were lined with cabinets, heavy velvet curtains, and hangers specifically tailored for aristocrats. Casanova immediately moved to rid himself of his prison clothes, his filth, and that heavy smell of sweat and rust. He found an elegant aristocrat's costume made of silk fabrics with gold embroidery hanging there. He applied the powder standing nearby to his face and hair, straightened his lace shirt, and fastened a silver-handled sword to his waist. Now he was no longer a fugitive, but appeared as one of Venice's most brilliant aristocrats, rid of his prisoner rags. When he looked at himself in the mirror, he saw that the old Casanova, the phoenix rising from the ashes, had returned. He began to walk confidently through the corridors with Father Balbi. When they came to the door where the guards were, the guards did not find a fugitive, but an arrogant, self-confident, and elegant gentleman who appeared to have worked late and was weary from labor. Casanova walked out the main gate without being subject to any questioning, saying, "Good night, gentlemen," to the guards. When he got into a gondola and moved away from Venice, he hadn't just escaped from a prison. He had written the history of the impossible. Venice was now a nightmare left behind, and all of Europe lay before him. From then on, he would be known as Europe's most famous escape artist. When Casanova's path led to Paris, what awaited him was not just freedom, but an unbelievable fame. The story of Venice's unbreakable man had become the greatest source of excitement for the French aristocracy. Everyone wanted to host this genius fugitive in their own salon and hear that escape story directly from his mouth. And of course, the secrets of the Venetian nobles. Casanova managed this interest professionally. He was not just an adventurer, but also a doctor of law who graduated from the University of Bologna. In the most famous salons of Paris, he stood out not just for his love adventures, but for his deep analyses of mathematics, economics, and world politics. When he presented the National Lottery project to the king to save France's treasury from the brink of bankruptcy, he became one of the country's most powerful financial figures overnight. Paris was now at his feet. Yet Casanova's true genius lay not in managing money, but in playing the human soul like an instrument. He was the first great master of empathy history had ever seen. While the aristocratic men of the period saw women as trophies or property, Casanova focused on understanding them. He would discover a woman's deepest fears, suppressed desires, and the dreams she could tell no one. While making them feel like the most important person in the world, he was actually opening all the doors in their minds. For Casanova, every woman was a new continent to be explored, a complex equation to be solved. He appealed not just to women's bodies, but to their imaginations. He read poems to them, took them seriously, and created that delicate space they needed in the coarse world of that era. This emotional intelligence opened the doors to Europe's most private bedrooms for him, while simultaneously creating a conduit through which the most secret state secrets would flow. Casanova was now a shadow agent who transformed information gathered from bedrooms into diplomatic moves at dinner, with secret ties to Masonic lodges. While wandering through Paris salons like a legend, behind every smile and every touch of his lay a stone-cold intelligence and a data collection operation. He was a master who combined manipulation with love and strategy with pleasure. Kings consulted him. Ministers were wary of him, but he, as always, played according to his own rules. He was also a giant in the famous underground casinos of Paris. He calculated probabilities, read people's weaknesses like a map, and psychologically defeated his opponents before the cards were even dealt. He was a master gambler. On one of the glittering and lustful nights of Paris, Casanova met a young girl named Lenilda. Lenilda was the purest yet most beautiful woman Casanova had encountered to date. Every move and every laugh of the girl awakened a strange sense of familiarity in Casanova. It was as if he remembered her from somewhere, from a very distant life. Her tone of voice, that mournful depth in her eyes, shook Casanova deeply. This feeling was far beyond simple lust. It was perhaps a kind of cosmic attraction. But he attributed this only to the girl's unique beauty and a trick of his own aging heart. For Casanova, Lenilda was to be the most precious piece he would add to his Paris collection. To win the girl, he applied a seduction plan meticulously crafted over months, like moves in a chess game. He bought her rare gifts and included her in the most secret philosophical discussions. He took Lenilda to operas and spoke to her of the stars and the love stories of antiquity. Lenilda eventually succumbed to the charm of this aging but charismatic giant. Winning her was a new pinnacle for Casanova's ego. Yet this victory would actually be the greatest defeat, the heaviest sin of his life. The tragedy erupted on the morning after the long night Casanova spent with Lenilda. Lenilda's mother suddenly entered the room where they were staying. The moment Casanova saw the woman's face, he was shaken as if a bucket of boiling water had been poured over him. Time stopped at that moment. Even the smell of the candles about to go out in the room grew heavy. The woman facing him was that noble woman he had been with for a single night in Venice 20 years ago, leaving her bed without even asking her name. When the woman saw her daughter beside Casanova, in his arms, she let out a scream of horror that shook the walls of the room. Lenilda was the fruit of that night Casanova had disregarded as a routine victory. Casanova had just gotten into bed with his own biological daughter. Why the mother had hidden her from Casanova and fled so desperately now became clear with bitter clarity. The woman had fled from city to city for years to protect her daughter from this man, keeping the secret of who Leonilda's father was. That familiar expression on Leonilda's face had now turned into a nightmare, a curse. Fate had taught Casanova its greatest lesson through the thing he loved and trusted most: desire. When Casanova fled Paris that day, he was leaving behind not just a city but his own soul. This incestuous tragedy he experienced was the greatest turning point in his life. From then on, no woman and no victory could brighten the darkness within him. The monster he had created had finally caught him in his own bed and torn his soul to pieces. Paris was no longer a paradise for him, but a hell. He did not speak for days, could not look at anyone's face for weeks, and grew a little more ashamed of himself every time he looked in a mirror. In the final years of his life, Casanova had been expelled from all the great cities of Europe due to scandals, allegations of fraud, and never-ending enmities. He had lost his money in London, was held in contempt in Berlin, and thrown into prison in Spain. His money was gone, his magnificent clothes were worn out, and his famous health had deteriorated. That captivating face for which women once fought duels was now covered with deep lines of sorrow and traces of illness. He was now met in the salons he entered not with respect but with pity or even disgust. Nothing remained of his old energy. He had turned into a mere shadow. No one believed that he was that famous escape artist, that genius mathematician. People saw him as a fashionable relic from the past. His final refuge was Dux Castle in the north of the Czech Republic. The owner of the castle, Count Waldstein, had given him the title of librarian as a debt of loyalty to an old friend. This was the most cruel punishment given to one of history's greatest adventurers, one of its freest spirits, to remain stationary and rot among dusty books. The castle was immense, but for Casanova, it was a cell narrower than the leads. He wandered silently among the shelves of the library, speaking with the ghosts of the past. The dusty smell of the books reminded him of the smell of his lost years. Casanova was a total stranger in this massive, damp, and dusty castle. The young servants mocked him as an old-time rake, spat in his food, and made fun of his missing teeth and his now obsolete French. He was like an old item forgotten in a corner of the room. Casanova had covered all the mirrors in his room with black cloths, because the broken-down old man he saw when he looked in the mirror was like a caricature of the Giacomo Casanova who once defied death on the roof of the Leeds and managed the treasuries of kings. He was no longer a human, but just a ruin left from the glory of the past. The coughing that echoed in the empty corridors of the castle in the evenings was a mournful and suffocating echo of the triumphal laughter that once rang out in the Venetian canals. Every night he fought the ghosts of the women in his past and the mistakes he had made. Leonilda's face entered his dreams every night, reminding him of the sin he had committed, that inevitable price. One night, considering suicide due to the heavy depression brought on by loneliness and being forgotten, he sat at his desk with trembling hands and took up his pen. He said, "If I hadn't written, I would have gone mad." Thus began the story of my life, L'histoire de ma vie. Casanova refused to die and decided to rebuild his life with words and ink. Throughout 3,500 pages, he wrote without skipping any detail or hiding any of his sins. He poured onto paper all of 18th century Europe, its food, its smells, palace intrigues, clothes, loves, and most importantly, the darkest depths of his own soul. While writing, it was as if he grew young again, climbed those roofs again, and lived those impossible loves again. Ink was like the blood in his veins. As it was poured onto the paper, he returned to life. Every word was a part of the freedom he had once lost. As he wrote, he tried to escape from Leonilda's shadow and pay the price of the sins he committed by pouring them onto paper. This massive work was not just a memoir, but a gargantuan reckoning a man had with himself, his society, and his God. In his book, Casanova defined himself thus: "I was not a saint, but I was not a devil either." I was just a mortal who wanted to feel life with all his veins, having weaknesses and passions. In 1798, in the dim light of his library, his final words as he passed away with his pen in his hand were like a tragic summary of a life. I lived as a great philosopher, but I die as a Christian. When Casanova died, the world thought it had only lost a womanizer. But in fact, the world had lost one of its most rebellious sons who believed in the impossible, rejected limits, and turned his tragedy into a work of art. Today, when you hear the name Casanova, let not just bedrooms come to your mind. Let that passionate genius come to mind, who reached from a prison cell to the hearts of kings, paid the heaviest prices, and finally wrote his own history with his blood and ink. His story is actually a story of that unstoppable desire for life, freedom, and being understood that is within us all. He is a tragedy who sought the truth behind masks, but remained under the masks he himself created. He placed his life on a gambling table and managed to hide the cards in his hand until his last breath. Even today, he whispers to us, life is too tragic to be taken seriously, but too beautiful to be given up. I hope you have listened to this gripping, jarring, and thought-provoking life story without getting bored. History is full of such terrifying and fascinating stories, and I will continue to tell them to you. To support me, you can subscribe, like, and comment. What are your thoughts about Casanova? Let's meet in the comments. See you in another mysterious cell of history in the next video. Goodbye.